Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. This week, it's actually going to be a best of. I don't think I've ever done this before, but I was realizing I needed to kind of tap the brakes a little bit so that I could get to episode 100 at the right time in early December. Oh, by the way, if you haven't heard yet, we're doing a meetup in Portland, Oregon, December 1st, Friday, 7 p.m. at the Beermongers. If you can be there, would love to meet you, hang out, have a frosty beverage or two, or three, depending on how things go, and chat up things. But in the interim, I've got to kind of take a break here. But I don't want to leave too many empty spaces in the schedule. So for the next few weeks, when I'm not doing a new episode of the Pedalshift Project, I'm going to be featuring a couple of best ofs based on your downloads. I've got all those statistics that say, well, what are the most popular episodes? And I'm going to rebroadcast them because, well, if they're popular, they're probably popular for a reason. So rebroadcasting this week, episode number 049 of the Pedalshift Project, and actually I can understand why this one was popular because it has a few things going for it. It's talking about bicycling the C&O, the Chesapeake and Ohio National Historic Towpath. It's a really good one. It got a little wet. I talked about that a little bit. Got into wet weather gear as well, and I still stand behind all of the things that I talked about in that episode. And probably most importantly, I think one of the more important things in the bike touring pantheon of topics, bicycle gearing. I revisit an older episode, which was episode 015, episode 15, learning about gear inches and gear calculators, and I go much more into bike gearing. So it was kind of bicycle gearing 201, important stuff for you as a bicycle tourist. So we'll be back next week with a brand new edition of the Pedalshift Project. Without further ado, here's me. Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle, from tips and tricks to ideas on how to tour more. Let's shrink the world by bike. You can read more on pedalshift.net, email the show pedalshift@pedalshift.net, check Pedalshift out also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Show notes are available for episode 49 at, you guessed it, pedalshift.net/049. A big hello to everybody out there. It feels like it's been a while since the last episode, even though it's only been 2 weeks. I'm still on the bi-weekly, fortnightly schedule as usual. Had a very exciting bike tour that I would love to talk a little bit about, revisiting the C&O. And also on this episode, we're going to be talking more about a couple of areas of gear talk, some wet weather gear talk and some gearing revisited. So it's all about gear. And then we're going to be wrapping it all up with some connections and some other talk as well. Let's get cracking. First up is the Journal. The Journal is where we talk about bike tours, your bike tours, my bike tours. Let's talk about mine. I did a great weekend trip on the western end of the C&O, the Chesapeake and Ohio National Historic Park Towpath. That's why I always say C&O. It's very long. As many of you know, I'm in the DC area most of my time. I do have a cabin out in the West Virginia area that's not too far from the towpath. So the C&O is sort of a staple of my bike touring. And location alone is only one of the reasons. I mean, it's a real gem. It's one of the great bike touring destinations out there. So if you're trying to come up with a bike tour, this one is one you may want to consider. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my weekend adventures. I did, as I mentioned, the western end of the C&O, going from Hancock, Maryland to Cumberland, Maryland. So that is about mile marker 124 or so on the towpath to 184.5. And of course, I had a little bit of extra in there as well because I started and ended at my cabin, which is in right at the western edge of Berkeley County, West Virginia. If you're familiar at all with the state of West Virginia, it's got that funky little panhandle in the east. Well, my place is about dead center in the middle of that eastern panhandle. So it's a great location, and it's great for being able to do a C&O adventure, especially on the western side like this. So what I did was I had this all planned out where I was going to drive out, leave my car at the cabin, and then bike out from there. And there's a lot of different ways to get to the trail, including a somewhat quasi-legal crossing of a active CSX rail bridge, which I haven't done in a long time. But since I was going westbound anyways, and it really didn't add any miles, I decided to take the road route. It takes you to an actual bridge that you're more technically allowed to cross between Berkeley Springs and Hancock. I think it's on a US 522. It's actually a little bit of trivia. That is the skinniest part of the state of Maryland. I think it's only a couple miles wide north to south at that point. If you ever look at a map, you can kind of see where that is. In any event, I had the plan of rolling to there and then grabbing the trail from there and then camping maybe another 20 miles in. And then the next day completing the trail while doing some research and making some field notes. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Camping in Cumberland and then taking the Amtrak back from Cumberland to Martinsburg. Martinsburg is the largest city, I'll put that in quotes, to my cabin. It's about a 20-mile ride away from it, and taking a road route from there to finish it all off at the cabin. So multimodal, a little bit of road, a little bit of, a lot of it of C&O. It was a lot of fun riding, and this was the first time I ever did anything like that. Again, for those of you who have not been following the show, Amtrak only recently, as of last fall, added on rollerboard service for bicycles, and there are a bunch of stops on the Amtrak line. Only one train a day, unfortunately, in each direction, but along the C&O that makes it kind of easy and nice to be able to get through to it. So that was the overall plan. Here was the downside. Friday, the day I left, it was raining, and it was raining hard, and it was about 52 degrees or so by the time I was all packed up and ready to go. And that is a very similar temperature to, for those of you who listened to the last episode, temperature and conditions that James and I, Mysterious James, said no to in Big Sur. We just holed up in the little lodge there in Big Sur and had a great 0 mile day. And that was a great choice at the time. For me, although I will admit that I did consider doing something different, maybe just camping near my cabin. But since I had a renter at my cabin, I couldn't stay at my cabin. So, I thought, I guess I could kind of camp nearby or whatever and just wait this rain out. But then I thought, you know what? I've got some new rain gear. I was prepared for some rain, maybe not that crazy rain. And I decided, you know what? Let's just go for it. And I have to say, I'm really glad I did. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my rain gear in the gear talk section, because that was the difference between me having a reasonably fun time and having a lousy, awful time. So I'll talk more about that in a few segments. I had a good experience on the first segment, which was going from my cabin along some West Virginia back roads to Hancock, Maryland, where I picked up the trail there. And I will have to say that West Virginia is a tough biking state. The terrain is really variable, and where I live is actually a really flat part of the state comparatively. It's pretty hilly, not too bad, but I do have to say that most drivers just aren't used to having bicyclists on these roads. And that's why I tend to avoid especially the highways, Highway 9 in particular, which is the main drag that goes through the middle of the Eastern Panhandle. I minimize the amount of time I'm on that. And when I say minimize, I'm talking like a few hundred yards. That's how bad it is. So as a result, I've got kind of a windy backroads route that does get me to that bridge. It's about 20 miles when all is said and done, maybe 21. And it worked out just fine. It was wet. It was cold. But, for those of you who have done bike touring before in the rain, you kind of know that as you're going, there's a certain point where you can't get any wetter. And if you've got good rain gear, you're actually staying pretty reasonably okay. And if you can manage your temperature, then everything is really good. Now, I tend to run a little bit hot. So it actually was fine that it was on the cooler side. The problem was when I stopped. So I'll talk about that in a minute. When I got to Hancock, I'll talk about it right now. When I got to Hancock, that was originally going to be a planned stop. So we're about, say 2 hours in or so, maybe a little bit longer. I didn't really stop much, and that's unusual for me in the early part of a ride. I tend not to like to go out real hard, real fast. I tend to like to take a small break at least every 10 miles or so. But this time, because of the rain, I just didn't want to and didn't need to. So I got to Hancock and stopped off at a gas station that I usually go to for picking up some sort of quick meals, and warmed up a little bit there. And that worked out really well. I went to a picnic table area within very close proximity to it. Actually, it was across the street. And I have to say, Hancock's getting a little sketchier lately, and I think that's a little bit sad. There was, kind of open drug use nearby, and it was meth, I mean, it's just it's unfortunate to see towns kind of falling into the grip of that devil of a drug. It's just the worst. And yeah, it was one of those things that
you also hear lots of stories and stuff. And, I don't want to get all preachy and stuff, but essentially the town, when I'm experiencing it lately, hasn't been real nice. And I tend to want to get out of there relatively quickly. It is the last place where you're able to get any kind of food or anything like that, basically until Cumberland. That's not completely true. There are a few places where you can go, but in any real way, it's sort of the last stop. It's also the last bike shop if you're going westbound as well. So, Hancock's kind of a necessity. But I am a little bummed out by just sort of the direction that it's going. And again, this is just my experience. If anybody has an alternate experience, I would love for you to share it here. I ended up choosing, this is a unique feature of Hancock. Hancock has 2 parallel trails running from the same place to the same place. And it's right in the middle of one of them. And that is the Western Maryland Rail Trail. Now, it's paved. And I think I've talked about it on the show before. This trip, I was fully intending on riding the C&O, which runs parallel with that, just because I don't think I've really ridden that portion very often. I may have ridden it once, maybe twice, because, when you've got a choice between sort of a earthen crushed gravel trail or a paved trail, well, you kind of want to take the paved trail. Usually it's really pretty and runs along the same area. So I generally tend to take that, if only for speed and comfort. And this time I was going to say no to that, but well, rain, right? When it all came down to it, I thought, I'm chasing the sunset a little bit to a certain degree because I didn't start until about mid-afternoon from the cabin to begin with. So to be able to have time to be able to set up camp, and frankly, set up camp in kind of adverse conditions with the rain, I thought, let me make up, the 15 extra minutes that I'll save by being on the paved trail as opposed to the C&O. And I think that was the right choice. I will say that the tires that I do have on the Safari, I rode the big bike this time. They're 2 inches wide. They're Schwalbe Marathon Schwalbe Marathon Extremes. I'm going to have to look this up again. But they're a Schwalbe Marathon style, and they are really, really great for handling the C&O. So when I did transfer to that about 10 or 11 miles later, it just worked out really well. But the trail quality on the C&O at that point was actually pretty good despite the full day of rain. And frankly, the weeks of rain. We are, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, DC has had 15 consecutive days of rain. It's like the freaking Pacific Northwest right now. It's crazy. So the trail condition, despite that, all of that rain, was actually not that bad. I was a little bit worried about the river. Those of you who have followed this show and followed my exploits for a little while know that I once got flooded out on the C&O during an evening at one of the campsites that was closer to the river. So I was a little bit concerned about that. In any event, the river was holding into its banks. Luckily, this was sort of more gentle rain throughout the week. And the trail conditions was totally fine, and everything was all good. One thing that I think is incredibly important on a trail like the C&O or any of the trails, I think the Katy Trail is like this as well, certainly parts of the Erie Canal towpath, you really want to have fenders. If you're going to be facing the possibility of rain at any time. And frankly, most of these places, you do have a shot of some rain at some point. The number of people that I saw on the C&O without fenders was really shocking, and they were just covered, and their bikes were covered. It does make a difference. It is worth getting, and it's something that I would definitely recommend. I have pretty good fenders on my bike, and I'm really happy that I had them, especially for that first day, because it would have been miserable otherwise, and including the Saturday as well, because there were plenty of puddles, as I'll get to in a little bit. The campsite that I ended up at was a really nice one. I'll talk about the campsites in a little bit as well. I had no cell phone signal. Once you get past the end of the Western Maryland Rail Trail, that's in Pierre, Maryland, I believe it's called. I'm not even sure if there's a town there, but I know that there's a name. You're not going to be having too many cell phone signals. And if you do, we're talking really limited. So no data, no anything like that. And that's another reason why I didn't do any kind of tour journal for this trip, because I knew the majority of it was going to be in a signalless area. The one thing that I did do, and I prepared for, knowing that I had a strong chance of not having a signal, was that I rented a documentary on iTunes called Inspired to Ride, and I've got a link in the show notes to their website. It's about the Trans Am race, and if you are a listener to the Sprocket podcast, Nathan Jones is one of the co-starring folks on that. I want you to definitely check that out. It was really, really good. There were some kick-ass people in that. I have 3 words for you: triple overnight centuries. I mean, it was intense, the number of miles these folks were doing. Now, of course, they were doing it self-supported. They were not loaded at all, except for one Canadian guy who was probably carrying a little bit too much because he was doing an all liquid diet for the first, 2,000 miles of it or so. But it was a really interesting ride. And of course, it made me feel like a complete wuss, trying to oh no, I'm only going to do 60 miles today. And meanwhile, these folks are doing like 290, 300 miles in one shot. Just incredible. And we're talking over real terrain over the Rockies. Inspired to Ride. That's a little sidebar for you. Go check it out. I think it's available in a bunch of different streaming places. I believe it may be on Netflix as well. But since I had no signal, I had to rent it, and I was happy to do that. So go check that out. Saturday morning, woke up and the rain had stopped. It rained all night. And, I should say a little bit about sort of the camp scenario with all of that. If you've never had to deal with setting up a tent in the rain, it's a little bit of a drag. The one really lucky thing was the rain was starting to ebb a little bit by the time I got into camp. The other good thing was there was enough of a canopy where I was at, and going under a tree during a rainstorm, especially in a place where you don't know about, it's not super ideal, but this is a pretty wooded area and you can't really avoid being under a tree. But I was able to set up with minimal amount of wetness getting into my tent before I got the tarp up and over it. And of course, there's all sorts of techniques, and definitely check out YouTube for all different types of things that you can do to avoid having that. But there you are, kind of covered head to toe in wet, right? And you want to sort of peel off your waterproof layers and not get them in the tent to soak everything up. But at the same time, you want to kind of stay dry. So it's a bit of a little kabuki dance, if that's such a thing. And, but it worked out fine. And, I have plenty of coverage with big vestibules for the tent that I have, and it worked out really well. That tent's been a real friend, a real friend of mine for all of this. So, that worked out really well. Woke up Saturday. Of course, you might be able to hear my dog in the background. Sorry, he's snoring away. He's had a rough day. I walked him all around, DC today in the rain, of course, because it doesn't stop raining here. Saturday, woke up and I had the project, and the project was that I was going to be recording a lot of field notes for a new project that I'm going to be doing, and that is the Pedalshift Guide to Bicycling the C&O. I'm going to be building a free resource, and the page is at pedalshift.net/C&O or Cando. So C and O spelled out, because I guess you can't use ampersands or plus signs in URLs, but Cando, C&O. I'll be supplementing that over time. And at some point, I might put out a beefier trail guide, maybe something that's print or maybe downloadable or something like that. And I'll be asking for your help on what to include. So more to come on that, but check that out. That's pedalshift.net/C&O. One of the things that I wanted to do on this trip was to really get a lot of pictures and really get a lot of good information on the campsites. And one of the intentions that I have for this Pedalshift Guide to Bicycling the C&O is to have good ratings for all of the campsites. If you're not familiar with the C&O, there are a ton of free hiker-biker campsites all along the trail. They're no more than 10 miles apart and often about 5 miles apart. You've got some great amenities. This is all National Park Service. It's free. It's great. It's one of the great reasons to consider this as a future touring option for you. But what I've found from many of the resources that are out there is there's not a lot of information on some of the geographic aspects of it, or geological or hydrological. After having the issue that I ran into a few years ago where I got flooded out, I thought it would be good to rate each of these so that you kind of know what you're getting into. There's all sorts of different factors that I'm going to be putting in there. And I'm going to start off by just giving them sort of 1 to 5 star rating. as I go along here. But at some point, I'm going to break that out into different things to consider as well, because I think there's a lot to consider at different camps. Some of them are very close to parking lots or other areas near population centers. So what you end up getting is the possibility of having a kegger there one night when maybe that's not something you want, or maybe it is something you want and you would be cool with that. Technically, they're not allowed, but they happen. Trust me. The other thing that you'll end up with is, if you really want a remoteness feel to it, you're going to want to stay away from any place where you're going to have a possibility of somebody who's not hiking or biking coming along. Also, where it is relative to the river. Like I said before, if it's a really crazy rainstorm that's happening, you really don't want to be on a campsite that's very close to the riverbanks, just in case it floods. Trust me. And so there's a lot of other factors that I fold in there as well. Train tracks, noise, things like that. So I'm going to be talking more about that in the future, and that's all going to be updated as I go along. So I was able to hit, I want to say 10 or 11. I'll have to double check on that campsites, on that western third. And those are ones that I don't get to as much because it's on the far end of the trail from where I generally live. So that's all good. So pedalshift.net/C&O or /Cando, sort of like Lando, but with a C. More to come on that. And it's going to be constantly updated. So take a look. Back to the trip. The trail generally got really soft and really muddy on that portion of the C&O. It was kind of nasty in parts, and there was a point where the mud caked so much up that it actually was creating friction between my tire and my fender, and it wasn't going away. So it was a very clayey like mud, and it was kind of nasty. So I had to clear it out quite a bit. Saw quite a few people touring on Saturday as it was starting to warm up a little bit, and I got a little bit closer to Cumberland and Old Town and places like that. I saw, and Pawpaw as well. There were a lot of people who were touring, and this is a little bit early in the year for it too. One of the reasons why I like to go a little bit early is because there tends to be a little bit more openness, but there were quite a few people. It was really good. I even saw a guy who was on a Dayhan folding bike, one of the ones that I used to own that is now in the great care of Peanut Butter Jar Matt. So I hope it's doing well. I saw one of its cousins out there on the C&O, which frankly on a weekend like that, I would not have recommended because the tires were a lot skinnier and I'm sure they were sinking into the mud pretty badly. I really appreciated my 2-inch wide tires for this trip. So went through the entire trip. It was really good. Got some great pictures. I'll be sharing those, of course, on the website. You can check it out, of course, in the show notes at pedalshift.net/049 to take a gander at some of those. Rolled into Cumberland right around dinner time, and I was starving and ready for some Krabby Pig. If you are an aficionado of Cumberland at all, or that end of the trail, that's, of course, the ends of both the Great Allegheny Passage, the Gap, and the C&O. The Krabby Pig is literally in between the two, right on the trails there. And it's a pretty famous spot. And I got a couple of good sized beers and I ate healthily, shall we say. Not healthily, but not healthily meaning it was healthy food, but healthily meaning I ate a lot, which was great. I decided for this trip that I wanted to try to camp at a place that I had not yet tried before, and that is the YMCA in Cumberland. And I had heard about it for years, and I actually had intended to do it last year when I did the C&O Gap through ride, but I didn't end up doing it for a variety of reasons. The timing of when I was getting there, I was actually ahead of schedule, blah, 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 blah. So I won't kind of go into all of that. But this trip, I wanted to be a little bit closer into town because the closest hiker-biker to the end of the C&O is Evetts Creek Campground, and it's about 4.5 miles away from the Cumberland rail station. And of course, I had a 9:30 a.m. scheduled train on Sunday morning, and I thought, you know what? I'd rather be a mile away than 4.5 miles away. Wanted to try it out. And oh, by the way, there's also the added benefits of the benefits that you get from the YMCA. And that is that you get all sorts of great stuff. You get great places, water. You basically get full run of the YMCA facilities. So if I had felt like it, I could have worked out. I could have shot some hoops. I could have done all sorts of things. I did not do any of those things. I filled up my water bottles. By the way, their water fountain, very good. Very solid water fountain. When you've got the water bottle kind of thing next to the water fountain, that's really good to begin with. So you don't have to tip your water bottle. Big ups on that. But it was very cold and very tasty. And after drinking kind of the iodine-y water all day, it was pretty awesome to have that available. The other bonus that I didn't know was available is that there's Wi-Fi there. So that was kind of helpful to download some stuff. It didn't quite stretch to the campground across the street, so you had to be in the facility for that, but that was totally fine. But most importantly, I was able to grab a shower, and I was kind of, after a couple of days of riding, I was ready for one, and it was really nice to have that. Normally when I do the C&O, I tend to go a few days without a shower, or I'll kind of do the trick where I'll dump my pannier and fill it up with water from one of the pumps and dump it over my head, especially on hot summer days. It was nice to have an actual shower here in Cumberland. So $12, full access to the facility, Wi-Fi, showers, good water fountain, decent camping spot. I thought it was all good. Downside is there wasn't a porta potty by the camping area, which is literally across the street. I keep using the word literally. It is, but literally is kind of overused. The campsite is great. It's flat. There's a pavilion, which was helpful because you guessed it started raining again. But the problem was with the no porta potty there, which it normally has. Once the YMCA facility closed, you didn't have a bathroom option. Now, didn't end up mattering for me. I won't go into details, but I took care of things in a way that was able to be taken care of with the facilities that I had. Okay, there we go. I'll stop talking about that. So the other downside is I assume that would be something that's going to be rectified later on in the year, that there'll be a porta potty. The other downside is a problem with Cumberland generally, and that is it is a major thoroughfare for CSX freight rail. And 20 feet away from you is an auxiliary line for CSX, which means that it doesn't get used a lot, but when it does, it's 20 freaking feet away from your head or your tent. So at one point during the night, I had a train go through that the experience was, we'll call it teeth rattling. It was pretty bad. You can't escape trains in Cumberland if you're camping. Evetts Creek, the campsite I talked about before, it's the same story, but it's worse because it's on the main CSX line. So you not only will have trains rolling through there at all hours, you'll have trains that'll park there for a while, and that's almost worse because they'll have, if it's a cooling car or anything along those lines, or the engine is right there, which I've had before, it'll be rattling and rattling and going, and it's a real drag. So I think it's one of those things that you've just got to deal with, unless you decide to go with a hotel night. And there's a few hotels there in town that are relatively decent as well. So, you compare Evetts Creek to the YMCA. I think I may do the Y again. I really liked it. The upside of Evetts Creek is that it's free, and it's pretty good. So proximity, shower, I'm going to go with the YMCA, and I thought it was really good. People were very nice there. So after a pretty reasonable night's sleeping, I ended up waking up at a very reasonable hour, right with the sun, and had plenty of time to pull together. Checked my phone and saw that the train was an hour late, which is not unusual for the Capital Limited, I believe is the name of that line. It comes all the way from Chicago. And when you consider that you're rolling through all of those states overnight and through all those regions, the fact that it was only an hour late, that wasn't too bad. And it certainly has been much worse before. Ended up going to the train station just casually, got some breakfast in town. It was nice that it was only a mile away. Rolled to the station, loaded up. Same experience as I've had on the train in other ways. Got the bike in. Was really very good with the conductor. Conductor was very helpful for helping me getting the bike up and in, and even let me keep my big duffel bag with my panniers with my bike, so I didn't have to haul it around. It was because it's about 40 pounds or so, give or take, and it was nice to have that, to just be able to leave that. And then I had an upstairs seat and got to basically undo all I had done, but look through a train window on the way out, which is always a little bit weird. Got to Martinsburg about 90 minutes later and unloaded there, got off, no problem. And from there, I had a 20-mile ride back to my cabin. And it was kind of uneventful, except for the fact that I had a really nasty 20-mile-per-hour head and crosswind, depending on which direction I was going. But it all worked out fine, and I got back no problem. And it was really interesting because there was a big contrast. It was very sunny and cloudless, and that actually in some ways was a little bit harder for me than the rainy, cold day. So go figure, right? To sum it all up, I just love the C&O. When you factor in the Amtrak fast forwards, you've got the stations in DC, Harpers Ferry, Martinsburg, and Cumberland. You really can mix up the ride and take advantage of the trail for just the time that you have. So I encourage anybody out there who is looking for a tour, this is a good one. And like I said, you can do some of it, all of it. You've got bailout options. You got fast forward options. It's a really good trail, really great bike tour. And I'm really happy that I'm going to be able to add some more out there, some more information in the Pedalshift guide to the C&O. So just check that out. It's not very full right now, and it's going to be kind of a work in progress for time immemorial, perhaps. That's at pedalshift.net/C&O, Cando, like Lando, but with a C. Hey, I want to remind everybody about Pedalshift Plus. If you dig the show and you want more, I've got more for you. Pedalshift Plus is a way to get cool extras and help support this show, the Pedalshift Project, and helps me to bring more Pedalshift offerings to you in the future. Right now, I've got all 5 of the Pedalshift tour journals that I've done, and I'm working on new offerings that go beyond the usual Pedalshift Project goodness. Pedalshift Plus helps defray the ever-increasing costs of producing the Pedalshift Project and keeping it open and free for everyone. So if you like what we're doing around here and these extras sound good and worth a few bucks, they're there for you. And if not, they're not there for you, I guess you could call it that. Check out pedalshift.net/plus for all the offerings. I'm going to be adding more in the future, but for now, I've got 5 great tour journals there for you. No matter what, I'm thrilled to have all of you listening to the Pedalshift Project as we head into year 3. And I can't believe this is just a great bike touring goodness that I am happy to share with your earballs. Next up is Gear Talk. Gear Talk is a section of the show where I talk about, say it with me now, gear. Yes. I want to talk about the wet weather gear that I used for this C&O tour that I did this past weekend. And I have to say, I am really blown away by how good modern rain gear is, especially modern rain gear that is cyclist specific. And I'm going to start off with one of those, and that is from a company called Showers Pass, which is out of Portland. And their jacket, they have a bunch of different jackets. If you've at all kind of been in this area before, you're like, I want to get a rain jacket, blah, blah, blah. Showers Pass is usually a brand that you'll hear about. They're a little bit smaller company, but because it's cycling specific, I think it's something to consider. I decided to bite the bullet and go for it because I've heard so many good things about it, and particularly about this double century jacket. I'm just going to say, for the record, best rain jacket I've ever worn, and I've had a few. I will say that it's on the higher end of the price spectrum compared to others, and I think I've made the mistake in the past of trying to get rain gear that is just sort of passable and on the lower end of the spectrum. And this is definitely yet another example. And I can't believe that, I haven't been listening to myself on this. Sometimes it's better to pay a little bit extra and to get the nicest possible gear that you can get, because there is a demonstrable difference between the stuff that I've been wearing and trying and this jacket. My primary rain jacket has been an old Nike jacket that is actually close to 20 years old, but over time, the waterproofness of it has just deteriorated. I used to use it for snowshoeing and things like that, and it's a lot heavier and bulkier. And this Showers Pass jacket is light. It packs up super small, and it sheds water like nothing I've ever worn before. I've tried some other jackets that were really more glorified windbreakers, and this one is really awesome. I also, as I've mentioned before, I run pretty hot, so I appreciate that they've got some very clever designed ventilation options in there. There's one on the back that's sort of there all the time, but there's also some good pit zips, as the kids call them, that are really easily accessible, and you can do it while you're biking, which is not the case for a lot of jackets out there. So this was awesome. It's sort of file under duh that a company that's based out of Portland would be good about rain. But it's really that good. I was really happy to get it. I bought it. I talk about gear from time to time when I have good experiences with it. And I have to say this is a really good jacket. So I give it a full endorsement. I've worn it once in a pretty nasty rainstorm. If I had it in California, I think I would have been a lot happier. I did like that 0 mile day, but I do have to say the lesson from the California ride, if you listened to last week's show, was you should have rain gear with you just in case, because it's just a drag to not have it. And this jacket was really good. So one ding, they don't have orange And frankly, that kind of sucks because you know me, I like my orange. So I got white, which maybe wasn't a great idea, but the other colors really would have clashed with the rest of my orange. Yeah, so I went with white. Hashtag needs more orange. Next up, also from Showers Pass, another great product that I bought. It was the Showers Pass waterproof socks. I want to say, for the record, they feel a little weird. When you first get them and you put them on your feet, they feel like kind of scuba socks or something along those lines, or those, beach socks that you sometimes wear. So I was a little skeptical at first when I put them on. They're kind of heavy, kind of thick, but once my shoes got wet in the rain on the Friday, they really rocked because my feet stayed dry the whole time. And that was a really big revelation to me. I've always worn just kind of regular old wool socks and have been kind of not pleased with how it all ends up, because once they get inundated, yes, wool sort of technically keeps your feet warm, but the wind and everything just sort of pulls heat away, I always find, for myself. These have apparently 3 layers. They allow moisture out, but not in, blah, blah, blah. Bottom line is my feet would have been totally cold, totally raw in that weather. I've been in that kind of weather before, and I'm usually pretty miserable. I was fine with these on, and I really like them. I would say they stayed more warm than dry, but it was important to say that they were comfortable the whole time, which I've never had in a rainstorm like that. I mean, I was on the bike for at least 5-6 hours, maybe not 6 hours, but at least a solid 5 hours, probably 6 hours if you count my break, and had wet shoes. So I'll count 6. It was weird because I could feel the squish of my shoes when I was walking around. So it sort of had that feeling that you had wet feet, but not the kind of sensation of it. Or maybe it's the flip of it. You had the sensation of wet feet, but not the feeling of it. I have to say, A+, really, really like them. Best wet weather socks I've ever had. Showers Pass waterproof socks. Big fan of Showers Pass. I never owned anything by them before, so I have to give them some ups. Last but not least, the third piece of gear that I bought in advance of this trip, knowing that there was a chance of rain, was a product from Columbia, and it is their Trail Summit running gloves. Running gloves, you say. Why would you buy running gloves for cycling? Well, turns out that they worked pretty well. These seem to be on the way out, and I wonder if it's just because it's a season thing, but you might be able to find them. I got them I think from REI Outlet or something like that. I know they're on Amazon and a few other places as well, so you can check those out. They fit really nice. They're snug. They've got the crazy little fingertip thing and thumb thing where you can actually use touch screens with them on, which is kind of helpful. I mean, I use my iPhone a lot when I'm riding. They're waterproof and breathable. And like any waterproof and breathable product, after a little while, especially something that's soft like that, and especially if it's a glove, it's eventually going to fail due to exposure to lengthy rain. That was just my experience. By the time I got to Hancock, I took them off and I was wringing them out. Now, normally for most gloves that I've had like that, that's a total fail point. I've tried all sorts of different types of gloves in the rain, and I'm usually not happy with them after a certain point. But one thing that I'll say is that there's one little extra thing in these that kept it comfortable. Yes, my hands were technically wet at a certain point, but they were still warm and happy. And that was because inside, if you turn them inside out, these particular gloves have reflective material, sort of like those Mylar emergency blankets. And that was amazing. And they kept my fingers and hands all the way through totally warm the whole time. So I really like Columbia Trail Summit running gloves. I really like them. Any glove, if you're biking in the rain, water's going to roll down your arms and get into your gloves. And I think that the magic of these is that interior kind of reflective heat layer. So I know there's other gloves that do that as well, but I really like these. And I would also say that they're pretty good. So bottom line, for any bicycle riding where you're going to deal with rain, and particularly if you're going to go out for a multi-day tour, you really want to have some rain gear and get decent rain gear and get as good as you can afford, because this, for me, when all is said and done, my big takeaway is the same reason why I go with Ortlieb panniers and a few other things where I spend the money on good stuff. And that is that it does make a difference. Does that mean you have to get these types of things? And if you don't do them, you're doing it wrong? Absolutely not. No. You know, that's not how I go. But I will say that for some things, you do get what you pay for. And I'm here to tell you that at least for these things, they all rocked and they worked really well for me. So that's wet weather gear under Gear Talk. Next up, it's a double session of Gear Talk, and it's Gear Talk about gearing. You may remember back a few episodes, maybe a year or so ago. I'll have to go back and check, but I did an entire episode where I talked about gearing. And when I was in California talking with Mysterious James about gearing, I realized that it was time for me to sort of revisit gearing for your touring bicycle. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because even 5 years later, as I'm really much more into it from the very beginning, 6 years later, I think that's my sixth season. I'm realizing that what I didn't know at the very beginning was really costly to me in terms of enjoyment. And I want to try to give sort of the most, basic way of explaining gearing again. I won't go into the whole gear inches thing and gearing calculators and stuff like that. For that, go back to the old episode. I'll have a link in the show notes to that so you can check that out. But what I found is that for bike touring, your most important gear, generally speaking, is your granny gear. That's your lowest low gear, the one that you're going to use to climb. Because so often, what we hear in the bike touring community is, I don't like climbing. I don't like hills. I only want to do flat tours, blah, 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 blah. And I think that really takes away a lot of joy from some of the routes that you can get. I mean, I'm here to tell you the California ride, if you were afraid of hills, you wouldn't be able to enjoy the real majesty that is Big Sur. And I just think it's so freaking great that I don't want anybody to get into bike touring or to consider bike touring and be like, but I just hate climbing hills. The reason why a lot of people hate climbing hills is usually because their bike isn't geared for it. And I know that I had that problem as well. And when I started touring, I used to think that third gear was third gear, no matter what bike you were on. And I don't know why I thought that, but I had that misconception. So I found when I was bicycling with Mysterious James, he'd be like zooming ahead of me on these hills. And I'm like, I'm in decent shape. Why is he he's tackling this so much better than me? And I'd ask him what gear he was in all the time. And the reality was, as I've learned, I'm struggling to keep up with him, and he's using a much lower gear because his bike is geared much better and much lower than mine was. So he had much better mechanical advantage, and I didn't have it. So if you're new to this, or if you're even wanting to improve some things on your bike with hills, I'm going to just go through a really simple bit of sort of math, but not math, on how to deal with this. And basically, the deal is that if you're on a traditional touring bike where you've got derailleurs and you've got a front crankset and you've got a rear cassette, so all you internal hub people, the Brompton people, stuff like that, this isn't necessarily for you. Although there's good lessons in all of this, and that is get the lowest gearing that you possibly can. So this is for you derailleur types. What I roll on right now, I'm going to use that as my base just to say, this is a bike that can climb hills really easily. And that's on my Safari, of course. I have replaced the stock on it a few times, but I have a crankset in the front that is a 44, 32, 22. And the deal is, for your front crankset, you want to have the smallest possible gearing up there as possible. So that 22, you want that to be really small. That's pretty small for a 9-speed. In the rear, I've got a 9-speed 11 to 34 cassette. And what you really want back there is you want it to be as large as possible, as huge as you possibly can. So having 34 teeth in that rear makes it really climby. If you go to the gear calculators, which again, I'm not going to talk about on this episode, that translates with my 700C wheels, and they're 2 inches wide because the type of tire you roll on has an impact on these gear inches. That gives you 18 and a half gear inches. Quick summary on that. The lower the gear inches, the climbier your gearing is. So 18 and a half is a really low number, just to let you know. And that's why it can climb hills really, really well. And I was able to use it this weekend on some of the climbier parts in West Virginia, which was really, really great. So if I compare my current setup, again, 44, 32, 22 crankset, and 11 to 34 cassette. This is all in the show notes, by the way, so you don't have to write this down. You compare that to the stock Safari that I got at the time, because they've changed it a little bit since. I had a climbing gear. The lowest gear that I had back then was 23.5 gear inches. So 23.5, so noticeably higher than 18.5, and it was totally noticeable on hills. So just by swapping out the cassette and the crank set, at the time they needed to be replaced. I didn't, go in, just throwing away parts that were perfectly good, but that really gave me better climbing options, and it can for you as well on your existing bike. So on my first bike, for those of you who've been with me from the very beginning, this goes actually even before I even talked about Pedalshift. This goes to my uncommonlysilly.com days, when I talked a little bit about the Climate Ride bike. This is the bike that I struggled with a little bit on the California coast. So the similar area further north, of course, from where I was before. The lowest gear that I had, and I went back and I checked this because I was really curious, and it kind of prompted me to even have this segment in the first place. Its climbing gear was 35.6 gear inches. I mean, 35.6 right now is a mid-range gear on my current bike setup. And that explains everything to me. I struggled so much climbing the hills of Leggett Hill and Middle Finger Hill and all those other kind of north of San Francisco Pacific Coast route hills. And it was because I didn't have a bike that was built for climbing hills like that, especially fully loaded. Now, I was not loaded on that trip. I carried a few things, but not fully loaded. That was not a bike that would bike tour on anything but flats. And somebody stole it and kind of made that not a problem for me. Not that I wanted my bike to be stolen, but if you are having trouble with hills, I guess the moral of my story here is, if you're struggling with them, I'm here to tell you that it is probably not you. I'll say that again. It is probably not you. You shouldn't and you don't need to struggle with hills. They should be challenging, and they should be a little bit fun, because at the other end of a big hill is another hill that goes downhill, and that's freaking fun as hell to bomb down. They shouldn't be something that you dread and want to avoid. Next time you are looking to improve your bike situation, I want you to start thinking about gearing, especially if you're struggling with hills. I want you to take a look at replacing the cassette, replacing the crank. You've got to, usually when you're replacing a chain, most local bike shops will suggest that you replace the cassette as well, just because of the wear issue. It's not universally true, but that might be a good time to consider doing it. At the beginning of a new season, like we're in right now, you can improve your climbing abilities really easily by doing some normal maintenance on your bike anyways. So do both if you can. Go back to the show notes here at pedalshift.net/049. You can check out the configuration I've got. It works really well for me. 44-32-22 on the front, the crankset, and an 11-34 cassette for a 9-speed bike. It works out really good. Work with your local bike shop. Get as low of a gear as you can. Your top gears are going to suffer. You're not going to be able to go as fast. But frankly, how often are you going into that third chainring, if you're even a third chainring type? Some of you only have 2. On a touring bike, you are much better off having more climbiness rather than more speed. At least in my opinion. I know your mileage may vary. Some people want more speed than anything else. If you're going to be doing more bike packing kind of stuff where you're going to be super ultra light, well, maybe you do want to have those faster gears. If you want to go fast, sure. But if it's hills that you're struggling with, consider this sort of bit of dumbed down lesson, which is get as small as you can in the front, smallest chain as you can in the front, biggest as you can in the back, and that will give you the climbiest bike that you possibly can. So that's my little bit of imparting of knowledge for you, and I hope that that helps you climb that hill that you have been dreading. Next up is connections. I've got a couple of connections, people that have been getting in touch with the show with questions and whatnot. If you've got questions, if you want to reach out, you can definitely do it by email. That's pedalshift@pedalshift.net. You can also do it through Twitter, Facebook, show notes, anything like that. I also have a lightly used telephone line. You can get the number from the website. It's right there. And I would love to hear from you. Tell stories, to do all sorts of stuff. I think you got like 5 minutes or 2 minutes or something like that. Tell me stories. I'd love to hear from anybody out there because it's fun. And I think I've only gotten one voicemail in the history of the Pedalshift voicemail. So take care. Do it. I won't pick up. It's just like a Google Voice thing. But I digress. Anyways, Mark Van Mark Van Ram. We'll call you Van Ram, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Mark. He writes, thanks for your recent podcast number 48. One question on the Pacific Coast ride. Is it possible not to take any cooking equipment and still eat okay? I'm not a coffee drinker and could live off 7-Eleven food, Pop-Tarts, hot dogs, or better grocery stores, diners, etc. I want to pedal the whole thing, Canada to the Mexico border, and don't want to do the whole cooking thing. Well, Mark, yes, absolutely. I think that this is true in, I would say, almost any of the bike touring rides out there. It's all a matter of personal preference. But of course, you can have non-cooked foods that you take with you. I've been a fan lately of doing sort of a cheese and crackers kind of thing, which sounds very effete and very, I'll pair it with a nice white Chardonnay or something like that. But actually, no, it's awesome because it's good calories and it gets me some protein and things like that. Whether you are if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, it's a little bit easier for you to not worry about spoilage and stuff like that. I happen to not be, but whatever works for you. You can get dried foods, which tend to be light. I've talked about using a dehydrator or even using your little toaster oven to dehydrate foods on past blog posts and episodes of the Pedalshift Project. So check that all out. That's certainly something that's available to you. On the Pacific Coast route, the one that you're talking about, there are very few parts where you're going to be going very long without hitting any kind of stores. Really, it's in the Big Sur area. And that's about it in terms of having a day where you'll only have one option. I don't think that there is any day that I am aware of on the Pacific Coast route where you don't have at least one option. And sometimes that might be a very small store, but one option to get food. And in many instances, you have not only options for decent grocery stores almost every day, but you've got full restaurants and things along those lines. So if you want to leave the stove at home, it's real easy to do that on the Pacific Coast route. So I would say answer, yes. And it's something that it's tough because I talked about this, I think, on the last episode. I do like a nice cup of coffee in the morning, but on this past weekend trip, I did bring my alcohol stove with me, and I had, I guess my SBIT tabs were a little bit open, and you know what? It didn't heat up the water all that good, and after all was said and done, I waited a long time for rather lukewarm water because the fuel tabs had, I guess, it had evaporated or something like that, and I was kind of bummed out because I spent all that time making this relatively mediocre coffee and oatmeal. So I don't know. Sometimes you can bring a stove and still be disappointed, but I do like to have that cup of coffee in the morning myself. So I go back and forth on it. I do like the prospect of not having to have that weight and bulk. And frankly, I don't want to say pressure, but when you feel like you've got that stove, you're sort of like, well, I should use it. So you start thinking about it along those lines. So I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I've done a few days, and I think I talked about this on the show, where rather than a cup of coffee in the morning, I'll pop a couple of caffeine pills and roll off of that. I mean, I like using caffeine as a performance booster for bike touring. I've talked about that a few times as well. So, rather than have the cup of coffee, but frankly, as far as my caffeine intake preference, it's definitely coffee over pills. So sometimes I bring a stove. Also, hearing from friend of the show, Johnny K, friend of Bikey podcasts everywhere, Johnny K. So Johnny K writes, after a little bit of time off, I haven't heard from Johnny K in a little while, and he talks about some of the pictures that were on the last episode 48. Go check that out, pedalshift.net/048 for the California tour ride. And he had some good thoughts on, the notion of the Brompton, and also more revisiting of using offline maps and GPSs on devices. And Johnny K writes, the issue I have had with running these offline GPS apps is they suck up the battery, just like the bike apps that make your phone into a bike computer. I guess it's just the nature of them because they are trying to give you real-time information. But yeah, I agree. A good GPS for bikes would be needed for long-distance riding. I think it's needed more so, actually. I think that's right. And he also talked about he said, I'm not trying to plug REI, but every once in a while, REI, I do like to plug. He talks about how he took some good navigation courses with them and learning how to use a compass and a map. And I think that's really good for some of the types of trips that MJ's been doing, where you're sort of off the beaten path a little bit, maybe the Oregon Outback ride and some things like that, where you're really doing more waypointing than anything else. And, some of the rides that I do, well, frankly, they're on roads and trails, and it's hard to get lost on those, but it's a good skill to have, especially if you're going to be doing some backcountry riding. I think that's very true there. Johnny K, welcome back. Thank you, sir. Good to hear from you. Also, last but not least, we had Mim, who checks in about a Brompton tour, which looked really, really exciting, on Black Pearls, the name of Mim's Brompton, and was on Black Pearl for 2.5 months in Central America. Mim did not camp, hosteled, and worked with the tea bag on the front, which is tea, the letter T, not tea, like the drink, and had an interesting stuff about the setup. And go check out the show notes, or excuse me, the comment section to read more from Mim. But I think that the bottom line that I would take from Mim's comments as well, or I'll echo what Mim said, is that I think that it's really, really good that people are interested in touring on a Brompton. And Mim wrote, I'm going to quote this specifically, "I'm glad to see others tour on Bromptons. It's very possible with minus 12% gearing." And I think that that's totally true. I mean, I happen to have the minus 12% gearing. That's, by the way, it's a option that you have when you build a Brompton. And almost Bromptons are generally, you sort of order them sort of custom. I mean, there's certain areas that you get to play with, whether you get the plus 12% gearing if you want to have like a speedster bike, or minus 12% if you want to have more of a touring bike style, or one that can handle hills a little bit better in the handlebars and the seats and things like that, and the color. But I do think that the minus 12% gearing is an absolute must if you are considering using the bike for touring and you're going to be carrying A, any weight, or B, going on any kinds of hills, because frankly, it's just kind of necessary to be able to make things work. And as I documented 2 weeks ago on Pedalshift Project 048, it works really well. And Mim chimes in as well. So thanks, Mim, for getting in touch about your Brompton touring as well. Oh, hey, one more last plug for joining the newsletter. If you haven't joined the newsletter yet, one of the cool things that you get for that is you get a free pack guide. You get a little bit of extras every once in a while, especially you get access to the sort of quasi-live Pedalshift tour journals as I am recording them. But most importantly, you get an extra free podcast every month, and that's going to be happening in a few days. So if you are hearing this before, let's say the 15th or so, that's usually about when I put them out, make sure you sign up for the newsletter over at pedalshift.net. You can do that on the little top bar or bottom bar thing. You can sign up there, and also, of course, in the show notes as well. Get the extra podcast. It's always good. It's exclusive to Pedalshift newsletter subscribers, and newsletter subscription is free. Last but not least, I close out the show every time now by giving a big thank you to all of the monthly supporters of the show through the Pedalshift Society. That is a new thing that I have offering. If you like what you hear and you can help me keep the show listener supported while expanding the offerings, and one of the new offerings that I'm looking at is this new C&O online guide that I am putting together thanks to the support from Pedalshift Society and Pedalshift Plus folks. $1, $2, or even $5 a month helps with the cost of hosting and the ever-increasing costs of the podcast and the website and all of that kind of stuff. Plus, an angel gets her wings every time a new member of the Pedalshift Society joins. So please, if you're at all interested in supporting the stuff that we're doing here and helping me to expand and bring more stuff out there, check out the Pedalshift Society at pedalshift.net/society.
On to the Society. Ethan Georgie, Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lane, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Josiah Matthews, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Seth Krieger, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Noah Schroer, Harry Telgadas, John Sikorsky, Richard Killian, Chris Barron, Brian Wren, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Paul Mulvey, Stuart Buchan, Todd Stutz, Mr. T, Roxy Arning, Nathan Poulton, Harry Hugel, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Ruth DeVorsey, Michelle Miller, Matthew Lewis, Michael Baker, Billy Crafton, Paul Culbertson, Scott Culbertson, Matt Perry, Danielle Jepson, Cody Florshinger, Tom Beninati, Bobby Ruppel, Roy Everett, and new this week, Greg Brathwaite and John Mayer, and all anonymous and past contributors. Thank you for helping make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.